The subject of today's presentation is considerations for optimal estate provision. A bit of a grand title for where do we put our premises and where do we locate them. So what is in a location? The first thing to do is to think about the location. What's in a location? Estate decisions are typically some of the most important strategic, long-term considerations that an organisation will make. Getting it wrong can have serious adverse consequences. It can impact the operation response for years to come. And these are large capital expenditure decisions, typically tied to long leases with high, exorbitant moving costs. Just think of all the money spent on estate agents, solicitors, and legal costs. It's critical that we get these decisions right. But what does right actually mean? This is something that we'll explore as we go throughout today's presentation. When it comes to estate selection, we've seen a number of trends over the past few years. These include co-location, fire, police and ambulance, all sharing a headquarters or estate. It becomes very similar to the North American model of emergency services. There's also been a trend of moving out of town, giving up those old, cramped premises for newer, purpose-built estate with better links to transport. Think ring roads rather than high street police stations. And it'll be interesting to see whether this continues post-COVID as people get back to work, or the trend may be that people want to work from home more often. What impact's that going to have on our society? And then finally, that balancing of workload. Some organisations have looked to spread demand differently across different resources. Where historically there may have been a central fire station, organisations may now choose to have the resources positioned around the perimeter of a town or city, with the ability not just to go into the city, but also serve the outlying areas. A key consideration with estate provision is the balance between what is optimal and what is practical. Common sense plays a huge role in many of these discussions, ensuring that estate would be fit for purpose. As an example, a custody suite placed in an out-of-town industrial estate, it might make sense from a location point of view, but the lack of infrastructure to get detainees home might provide a new challenge that wasn't anticipated. And then there's also the financial considerations. Land is expensive. Your budget will determine what is feasible. And to quote Kirsty and Phil, it's all about location, location, location. Now, during lockdown, many of us have found ourselves doing some home DIY. I myself certainly fell victim numerous times to the dreaded honey-do list. For those of you who are unfamiliar with such a thing, it's a task list generated through conversations with my wife. They generally start with her saying, "Honey, can you do that?" Anyway, I digress. I found myself at Howden's Joiner Company. During a discussion with the salesman, he said, "It is our aim to have a Howden's within 15-minute drive of everyone in the country." I smiled. I nodded, but inside my head, the cogs were turning. Is that feasible? 100% seems awfully ambitious. What do they currently get? Are the current stores optimally located? And that really is the premise for today's case study, exploring my curiosity into their locations. So, quick look at the map. Howden's have over 730 stores nationwide. Firstly, that's far more than I anticipated, and far more than I want to demo. As such, I'll decide to take Leicestershire as the example. Howden's have 11 locations within the county of Leicestershire. Providing coverage across the county, you've got 3 locations in the Greater Leicester area, or the City of Leicester, 2 areas in Loughborough, and the rest are spread out. Currently, the 11 bases that they have, or 11 shops, would serve 85.1% of the population within a 15-minute drive time of a Howden's premises. So, 85.1. Maths, not always my strong point, but does seem a lot lower than the 100% they were talking about. So let's dig into this a little bit more. If we were to take the list of 11 current bases, where would the optimal location be? Well, if they go with their central Leicester location, it's just to the south of the city of Leicester, first base, 41.5% of the county within 15 minutes. That's pretty good, isn't it? Just one location and we're getting to almost, well, just shy of half the people in the county. If we were to add a second location, that's going into the town of Loughborough. That takes us over 50%, so 51.5%. That's two bases using their current estate. 3, we go into Hinckley in the southwest. So pretty much just staying inside Leicestershire. But that's up to almost 60%. 4 into northeast Leicester, this area here, takes us to 2/3. 5 into Colville, 75%. 6 into Melton, just shy of 80%. 7 into Market Harborough to the south. And 8 into a South Leicester location takes us to 84.2%. So 8 bases, we can get to almost 85% of the county. So that's quite interesting. But what we see, as we'd see with facility location planner type projects we do, as you're adding more and more bases in, the incremental benefit of that additional base diminishes. So 41.5 to 51.5 shows a 10-point increase, but the increase seen from adding additional bases drops off as we add more and more in. So top 8 bases get us to 84.2. But if we just look at the top 5 current locations get us to 75.4%. That's assuming that we can only choose from our current locations. So the jump from 5 to 6, that 6th base at 79.6 would be in Melton Mowbray. However, if we weren't constrained just to Melton Mowbray, if I could to the current locations, if I could put my 6th shop anywhere in the county, we'd be looking at the south of Leicester in Blaby. That would generate as an 82.3%, so a almost 3-point improvement on the Melton Mowbray solution. So what we start to see here is that if we constrain our options, we tend to move away from an optimal solution. So how does that compare? The concept of a blank canvas. What if we were to completely start again? Not worry about where our current shops are, but to say we can put them anywhere in the county. Anywhere in the county, and what we want to do is get the most bang for our buck when it comes to hitting the highest proportion of population within 15 minutes. So what we've got, blue is showing your current estate, constrained to the current options, the 11 that we have, whereas the red shows our optimal locations, being able to place the suites, bases, premises anywhere in the county. So as you see, the red always outperforms the blue, but actually when we get to 8 bases in the blue, our current estate, we would get to 84.2 as we'd seen earlier. That 84.2 at 8 bases, well, we reach that in the red by only having 5 bases. In fact, we exceed it at 86%. So this seems like a no-brainer. If rather than having 8 bases and all the overheads that go with that, if I can get to the same amount of people, in fact more, within 15 minutes with only having 5 bases, surely it's a complete no-brainer. I should go with these optimal locations because it's going to give me better performance. Does that make sense? So I could look at this and say I need to get onto the phone to the managing director of Howdens and tell them all your locations are in the wrong place, let's get them moved and we're going to create more profit for you guys. Maybe. But we probably should look at these solutions in a little bit more detail. So here is the optimal 5-base solution that gave us 86%. Well, the first thing, just looking at these white dots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is that they focus very much on the west of the county. We don't have anything anywhere near Rutlands or Market Harborough. The eastern areas of the county have not really been covered. Now we know that that tends to be a lot more sparsely populated. So Rutland's very much rural, so they're going to be different to the sort of more urban areas in the centre. That's fine, but it does give you this question as well. If someone lived in Rutland and they wanted to stay in Leicestershire to get to their Howdens, they've got potentially quite a long journey. So let's look at the next stage, which we look at these locations in detail. So the first one is Loughborough, and actually it's chosen the Loughborough base, so I'm happy with that. It's the current location in Loughborough, so no changes required. The second base is down here. It's south central Leicester, and it poses a slight problem. It's a very central location. It's in the University of Leicester campus. It's going to be very challenging to find the land required. And we're not talking about a small house here, we are talking about a large scale building. It's going to be challenging to find that land because it's in a developed urban environment. It's going to be very expensive, and you'd think there's going to be widespread issues due to the university campus. So that looks problematic already. If we then look at the southern base, down here, this is this one here, top bottom left. It's a rural location to the east of Hinckley. So Hinckley's here, so it's the southeast of Leicestershire. But there's limited infrastructure in this area. It's B roads and potentially C roads around here. There's no passing trade. There's no other businesses around. It could be very challenging to have a business running here. And similarly for this rural location here, which is in northwest Leicestershire, so near Ashby, limited infrastructure. It's actually on greenfield site, so that would be challenging. And you've also got the problem of no passing trade. Yes, you've got A roads that are relatively close, but I think there are going to be some issues there through infrastructure. And then finally, the north location here, just off the M1. Great in terms of infrastructure, close to Leicester and close to the M1. Looks great. Transport links. However, that whole LSOA is in a residential area. You might struggle for planning permission to have a shop like Howdens in the middle of a residential area. Just looking at the locations on their own suggests 4 of them look like they could be problematic. And then there's another thing to actually consider. If we are going to move to these optimal 5, we've got to close down or move 4 of the 5 we've currently got. Actually, this one here, it's close to Ashby and close to Colville. We know from previous work there's already Howdens in Ashby and in Colville. Does it make sense to go through all the pain and cost of closing one of these stores down only to move it a mile down the road? Possibly not. So, typical considerations when we're looking at estate provision. The whole analysis has been done based on saying 15 minutes. What can we get to within 15 minutes? But is 15 minutes the right metric? If I'd said 20 minutes rather than 15, I would have got some considerably different answers there. So it's worth being aware of what the sensitivity would be for that. It's also worth thinking about what's the most important considerations, not just for a company but also for a customer when we start to talk about location of estate. Things like ease of access, the infrastructure and amenities required, land availability, and certainly cost are going to play an impact throughout. A lot of the work we've done in the past centres around venue suitability. We know where the optimal might be, but if we can't afford or we can't find land there, how different would another option be? Other than finding the absolute best, is there a way of quantifying how good certain locations are? That's certainly something I've done a lot of in custody suite locations in the policing sphere. And similarly, we've done a lot of work on degradation planning. Certainly for fire services prior to COVID, if I'm only able to keep some of my stations open because I'm not going to have enough staff due to concerns around COVID, which should these be and why? And finally, there's this point, we've talked about blank canvas versus your current locations, and at some point there may be a mix of these. So it might be that we are willing to close down old or unsuitable locations, but we need to keep certain ones due to either PFI or other consideration. So lots to think about in there. I'm going to finish with one example here. So this is a custody estate provision work we did. We've looked at each of the areas and said, okay, this Radford and Park area would be the optimal location. But if we couldn't find land available in there, how well would other options compare? So for example, Lean Valley here, 97%, that's pretty good. However, if you go into Sands, 77. So moving, depending on where you move to, can have quite an impact on that optimal location. So worth bearing in mind and being able to evidence that throughout. So in summary, I think it's useful to see that estate decisions tend to be strategic, long-term considerations with lots of moving parts or aspects to consider. Typically these are the length of lease, cost of buildings, availability of space, accessibility and infrastructure. So all things that may sit as useful components or things to think about as you go through the project. I think it's very important to understand the key constraints and how they affect the income. The question of what is your objective function? Are we looking to minimise our response travel time or maximise the number of fires we get to within standard? Depending on the metric will influence the outputs that come out. So be making sure that we're happy that we have the right metric. And as I've said, much of the work that we've done in the past hasn't necessarily been around finding the optimal place, but assessing the viability of known options. The blank canvas approach is great because it tells us what we'd like to do, but actually in real life there tends to be more constraints. You can't just buy up land because you want it, and actually budgets will play a factor. So lots of considerations to take into account here. That's all I had in terms of some of the considerations to talk about.